that, I'm delighted to introduce GMF President Heather Conley. At this global inflection point, Heather will offer comments on current geopolitical events and challenges, followed by a Q&A session moderated by GMF Transatlantic Fellow Peter Sparding. Over to you, Heather.
Karen, thank you so very much. It's great to be with you. I know this is an exceptionally busy end of the year, so thank you so much for making time with us. I wanted to begin, before I just share some brief remarks, and then Peter and I are going to get into a great dialogue and bring in your questions. I want to read a quote. This quote was by former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and he wrote in a recent edition in Foreign Affairs describing this moment today. The U.S. now confronts grave threats to its security than it has in decades, perhaps ever. Never has the United States faced four allied antagonists at the same time: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, whose collective nuclear arsenal could within a few years be nearly double the size of our own. And not since the Korean War has the United States had to contend with powerful military rivals in both Europe and Asia. And of course, Secretary Gates wrote that sentence well before October 7th and the events we see unfolding in the Middle East. So a few weeks back, President Biden gave an Oval Office address where he described this moment in history, this global inflection point. Well, GMF knows a little bit about inflection points. We were created in many ways to memorialize an inflection point in the 20th century with the creation of the Marshall Plan. So let me just spend a moment to tell you the history of that inflection point, because I think it is so relevant to us understanding today's inflection point. So 1947, the United States wanted to remain at home, work hard, rebuilding after the Second World War, enjoying the benefits of that costly but important global victory in World War II. But Europe was absolutely suffering deep, deep economic deprivation. And Europe was on the cusp, and certainly the US was on the cusp of losing all the gains it had made in Europe in particular after the Second World War. So a very bold plan was created, the European Recovery Program, which you know is the Marshall Plan. And of course, this was deeply unpopular. Officials went across the country convincing the American people that now was not the time to be isolationist, to retrench, but now was the exact moment to be externally invested and facing to preserve America's prosperity and security. So with that, on a bipartisan basis, the Marshall Plan was born in 1948, implemented, and then a year later in 1949, NATO was created. So I just want to talk about that moment. So we had to invest in our allies' economic prosperity, which protected their fragile democracies. And then, of course, we needed that security umbrella to protect the prosperity and the democracy. Not easy, but what that investment did was ensure that the United States won the Cold War and ensured that the international system wholly benefited the United States economically as well as militarily. Now, we face this extraordinary inflection point today, where again, we see war, the largest land war in Europe. We see now another regional conflict spilling across the Middle East. And of course, tensions are rising in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Taiwan Straits, in anticipation of the Taiwanese presidential elections, which are slated to be held on January 13th. And so we have this moment where, again, America's thinking, gosh, this is chaos. We should retrench. We should isolate. This is too difficult. Why are we spending so much money supporting Ukraine? Why are we spending so much money supporting our other allies? That same type of inflection point. So again, the same logic prevails. If we deeply invest in our allies, in Europe in this case, it's providing support to Ukraine, helping Ukraine win the war, helping Ukraine rebuild, protecting their democracy, and then next year in Washington, NATO will celebrate its 75th anniversary. And hopefully, with the inclusion of Sweden, NATO, which 75 years ago stood at 12 countries, will now be 32 countries. We're widening this umbrella of security. We're reaching out to our Indo-Pacific partners. So that same logic applies. Now, the challenge we have, there were many challenges. Number one, we don't have quite a strategy for managing and navigating this inflection point. I see the strategies of Russia right now to wait us out, make sure that we don't support Ukraine. And right now, the U.S. it's unclear whether there'll be a supplemental aid package, not only for Ukraine, but for Israel, maybe even for Taiwan. We see a waiting out strategy, maybe a different outcome in the European elections next year or the US elections next year. Maybe our adversaries just have to wait us out. We'll get tired. We'll be isolationists. Or maybe we need to redouble on that investment, redouble that investment in the economic strength of our allies as well as ourselves and our security strength. So I just wanted to highlight there's incredible historical parallels between the moment of the inflection point of the 20th century. And of course, GMF is a memorial to the Marshall Plan. We are doing an enormous amount of work to support and celebrate and honor NATO's 75th anniversary. But I sort of want you to remember those great parallels and values absolutely apply today. And even a more complex world where we see, again, the potential of conflict, we hope not in the Indo-Pacific, but as we see conflict in Europe and unfortunately in the Middle East. So I look forward to diving in on your questions. Peter, I hope I gave us enough to talk about, and look over to you to start us off with a conversation.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And thank you all for joining us. Many of you have already submitted questions in advance. I want to remind you, you can also submit questions during our discussions using the Q&A function on your screens. But before I get to your questions, I don't often get to interview my boss, so here I go. I wanted to, build on the overview you gave us and the history you brought in, and just go through some of these inflection points that you mentioned. And the first one, maybe the biggest one from a Washington standpoint, is China. In a few days, we're going to see an EU summit in Beijing, if I'm not mistaken. And I wonder if you could maybe give us a bit of an overview of your view on this triangle between the US, Europe, and China. We have seen in recent years efforts from Washington to get the Europeans to move along on the same path. What do you make of the current situation? Is Europe going to follow the American path, or is it going to hedge and stand between the two?
Well, Peter, thank you. It's a great question. And that's exactly why I use Secretary Gates' quotes so often. Because you often hear in Washington, we would prefer to have our challenges prioritized. So the US government calls China the pacing challenge. So our most significant challenge. But the problem is there is no one country that's the challenge. It is this adversarial alignment of Russia and China, who are now in a self-declared unlimited partnership. It's China that is certainly supporting through various means Russia. It's also Russia and Iran working together. Russia is transferring funding and technology for Iranian missiles. Iran is selling drones and missiles to Russia to use against Ukraine. North Korean munitions are now being purchased and being used in Ukraine. So we don't have the luxury of saying, well, we just want to worry about China and the rest will happen. They are working together. But China and Russia, just to pull those two out, they are different paced challenges, to use that word. China has a very bold vision of how it wants the international system to look like. We are in a transition moment. As I said, we really enjoyed 75 years of a US-led international system. That had a lot of costs to the United States, of course, and the investment in our security. It also had enormous benefits for our prosperity and our security. But what the Chinese believe and the Russians believe, that America's century is over. We're in decline. They look at our politics, they look at our economics, and they say, you know what? This is no longer the American century. For China, they say this is our historic return to great power. And it'll be according to our system. You will use our development paradigms, our security paradigms, our governance paradigms. The international system will conform to my interests, and they'll do that through certainly a very strong presence in the international system, and they want to increase the world's economic dependency on China. So it is hard to explain because, of course, we've gone to try to be a partner with China. Now we're competing with China. It evolves over time. So what I'd like to say is that we all of these see them together. You can't see China separately, and our allies are essential for getting this strategy right of this adversarial alignment. So just as the U.S. has created quite a journey on its relations with China. You think back, it was during the Obama administration, sort of seeing this, stakeholder partnership, being a responsible stakeholder, seeing China as a participant in the international system, following international laws and norms. That's no longer the case. They are competitors to a point of challenging in the international system. So what we see now is a moment of changing our policy towards China economically, making sure they cannot dominate in critical minerals, in computer, semiconductor chips, those things that we have redundancy and resilience in our system. That's step number one. And the Europeans are waking up to also the fact that dependency on China isn't good for the European economy. I think the challenge for Europe is that so many European countries, particularly Germany, which you know so well, their economic model is based on selling their goods to China, and they don't have an alternative strategy. I'd like Germany and Europe to see their alternative economic strategy actually in the transatlantic economy, in a more diversified economy. So it is harder for them to de-risk, which is just a nice way of saying we're not going to go full throttled into trading with China.
Great. I wanted to stay a bit in Europe. We have elections next year in
Everybody's
US.
having elections. It's
Exactly.
Election-palooza next
Exactly.
year.
And
Election-palooza.
in Washington, certainly everybody's focused on the elections here, of course. But as you already pointed out, there are elections in Europe for the European Parliament. And I wanted to get your take on, first of all, maybe you can give a brief overview of what you expect to see in the run-up, and then maybe during the elections, it's not clear to everybody what it might mean. And then secondly, what does that mean for the transatlantic relationships? I mean, the European elections will be ahead of the US elections, so maybe there will be a pause where nothing much happens. But what overall could change in transatlantic relations from this election?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, well, definitely because GMF focuses on the transatlantic, but this is a global election cycle next year, starting with the Taiwan presidential elections. India will have elections. And so this is really such a dynamic time. And so just to focus in a little bit on the transatlantic. So beginning early in the year, Russia, believe it or not, will be holding, and I'm going to put big quotes here on elections, which will just reaffirm Vladimir Putin's leadership until 2030. That is sort of the main kickoff for the Euro-Atlantic area. We may have UK elections even as early as May, and that will be historic. I think we'll see a shift in leadership there. But the European Parliament elections will be held in June. And I think in some ways, the Dutch elections that were just held last month in November give us a foretaste, I think, of what we are going to see. And that is an electorate that is very focused on immigration, which sounds very familiar here to Americans, very concerned about immigration. You saw sort of in the Netherlands, 3 of its longstanding political leaders leaving. So it was sort of this new slate of leaders and a very fragmented political spectrum. And so what happened was a very far right leader, Geert Wilders, who has been around for a very long time. In many ways, the focus on immigration legitimized his longstanding anti-immigrant posture. And he received the most votes. And of course, now sort of a coalition forming to see if they can form without the most popular party, while of course those parties almost have to adopt those similar anti-immigration parties to a point where centrist parties start to sound an awful lot like far-right parties. I think this is going to play out in the European Parliament elections, where we'll have a very fragmented political spectrum. The centrist parties, the old standard parties, the European People's Party, the Social Democratic Party, will continue to shrink, and the picture gets more fragmented. I think you'll see the Greens taking a big step back. There's been sort of a backlash against Europe's very advanced climate policies. The economic pain is being felt. I think you'll see the rise of the far right and the far left on that political spectrum. Worst case scenarios, it could be up to 30% of very Eurosceptic and very anti-American parties. So I think that you'll see that in Europe. That will make it more difficult for formation of the next European Commission to make important decisions about EU enlargement and the transatlantic relationship. And I'm wondering here, just to sort of turn back to the US, I think, again, you see the similar phenomena of centrism. Centrists in the country have been diminishing over time. More vocal and more extreme voices on the left and on the right are dominating the conversation. So what's the space for the center? Where do they go? And I think, again, in the US context, because we are so deeply polarized, both sides of our political spectrum are suggesting that if the other side wins, the side that loses its life will be over, or life as it understood it, or its values will be over. And that cannot be true. In a democracy, there's always a winner and a loser. Democracies course correct if they make decisions that don't meet their needs. It's not existential. It is how we refresh ourselves as democracies. But I think we're all going to be very concerned about how this, because for many Europeans, how the US votes, their security rests on that. And particularly, we have one potential presidential candidate who has suggested that they might withdraw from NATO. This has enormous ramifications on our allies. But it gets back to what I said in the beginning. It is the inflection point. I know a lot of people talk about autocracy and democracy. I would say for the US, it's back to are we going to stay internationally engaged? And that's what enhances our security and our prosperity? Or are we going to return to isolationism and say, nope, we're going to just hunker down here, but we know we can't protect ourselves. It's just going to come to us at greater cost.
Yeah. And let me take the opportunity to switch to the questions we received from our alumni before, because there's one that is a logical follow-up here. You travel a lot to Europe and speak to political leaders and business leaders. And one of the questions we received on the US elections was, is Europe preparing, or in which way is Europe preparing for the potential outcome of the US elections? Of course, in one case, not much would change if the current president wins again. In another case, you already mentioned there might be some rather grand repercussions. NATO, you mentioned, but do you see Europe preparing for this potential outcome? Can they? What is the current discourse, as far as you can tell, on this?
They're awfully nervous about it. And certainly whenever I go and travel to Europe, and I'm sure many that if you have friends and fellow MMFers are calling and saying, what's going on? What's happening? Obviously very, very nervous. They watch the polls carefully. In fact, I would argue Europeans are by far sometimes more knowledgeable about our own politics than many Americans. But because their security and prosperity very much resides with that, so we understand that. So nervous, but what I do say is, well, Europe will not be surprised. In 2016, everyone was shocked and surprised. There's no surprise here. You have to prepare. You have to plan for that as best you can. And that's, making sure your own security, you're spending on defense and security, you're preparing for that eventuality as much as you can. But so no surprises. I'm going to be a little provocative and push back a little bit, because while I believe President Biden and the Biden administration has put an enormous amount of focus and effort in the centrality of allies to U.S. strategy, it hasn't been easy for allies, even under the Biden administration. The Inflation Reduction Act, something that was seen as very harmful to European interests. We haven't resolved steel and aluminum tariffs. Mm-hmm. We've pushed the can down the road. So allies don't necessarily see everything perfect under one administration versus another. But clearly, whether it comes to Ukraine, which the Biden administration has been working so closely with Europe, you mentioned China, obviously working closely with our allies. I don't mean to suggest the Biden administration is very allied centric, and it's very, very appreciated. But we have some bipartisan underlying issues that quietly Europeans will say we're struggling, even with even the Biden administration on many areas.
Sure. Yeah. Another set of questions we received from the alumni was around Ukraine. You already mentioned it, so maybe I'll just start with the easy one, and that was the status of Ukraine's NATO membership bid. So someone actually asked, which is more likely, EU or NATO membership? I don't know if you want to place a bet, but maybe you can give us what's the take in Washington, in the foreign policy world or security world, on that bid, and if you can, also on the chance of becoming EU members.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Fantastic questions, by the way. Thank you guys so much for sending them in. So Ukraine will will sort of set a precedent in many ways, because NATO enlargement has always preceded EU enlargement historically. So this could be the first time we could see EU enlargement to Ukraine before NATO enlargement. And again, we believe security has to be ensured before that prosperity can happen. So just an interesting aside, there does not exist consensus within the NATO alliance about Ukraine's membership. Certainly we saw discord at the NATO summit this July in Lithuania. But it was interesting. You had Germany and the United States very hesitant about NATO membership for Ukraine. The other allies, even France, we can dive into that a little bit deeper, we're more forward-leaning and saying it's not going to happen overnight. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight in a hot war, but that this is the most cost-efficient and effective way to secure NATO is to bring them in the alliance. We right now have a very elaborate set of bilateral security guarantees that, quite frankly, they're important, but I don't think at the end of the day are the NATO guarantees of an Article 5 commitment. But I think this is very deeply held, and I'll just, to the Biden administration, to President Biden, he constantly reinforces that he doesn't want World War III to take place. None of us want that, of course. And I think in his mind, he believes that Ukraine's entrance into NATO would be a red line for Vladimir Putin. I just want to pause on that. Every red line that has been so-called crossed, the Russian regime has not escalated. Finland entering NATO with an 800-kilometer border with Russia, where the Russian government has said repeatedly that they would go to nuclear war if Finland were to be added into NATO. So I think the fear is the red lines are to keep us self-deterring us, and that's been fairly successful. But what we want to avoid at next July's NATO summit here in Washington to honor the 70th anniversary of NATO, we don't want to get into the quarrel that happened in Vilnius. Right. You had President Zelensky sending a very angry tweet as he was arriving at the NATO summit. What you want is clear, crisp language that says Ukraine's vocation is in NATO. We will work towards that in a closer partnership. That day is just not today. That day will be at some future point. If you give Russia a veto over any member entering NATO, you are giving Russia the power to decide what happens to a country, and you don't allow the citizens of that country to decide. All of this is about deciding. And right now, we're investing so much into Ukraine militarily, as is Europe, that, again, that return on investment means eventually, I believe they will come into NATO, but we just need to keep giving them very clear, forward-looking language that says you're going to get there, not today, but we're going to work towards that end.
We received the follow-up questions from the alumni, right? As we're talking,
this is happening live in action.
Combining the two issues we just talked about, right. U.S. domestic politics and Ukraine. So there's someone who is asking your opinion or your predictions on supplemental funding for Ukraine in the US Congress. Do you think the US, even before the election next year, potential changes coming after, but we're running out of money beforehand.
Yeah.
We heard yesterday. So what's your take on this?
Oh, so it's the top of my wish list for Santa. Ukraine supplemental with Israel, with Taiwan. So this is going to be very hard to accomplish in 3 weeks. Let's be very clear on that. I think there is a package to be had. I will also hasten to say, and this is the frustrating part, we spend a lot of time speaking with congressional staff, giving them information about our Ukraine programs, the work that we're doing. There is strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, for providing Ukraine the assistance it needs to restore its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. There's a very small but very vocal minority in the House that it's certainly very difficult to surmount. But I think there's a package deal. I think that we'll see, I hope, movement in the Senate first on combining 4 things: border security, and that certainly should be an important part of this supplemental package. I think right now the politics of this is making the Democrats swallow things on border security they don't want to swallow, and making Republicans perhaps swallow some things they don't want to swallow for Ukraine supplemental. But as I said, I want to step back from the politics of this, the day-to-day. And we understand everyone wants to get something out of it. That's what messy compromises are. Everybody has to gain something out of it. I just want to make it very clear. What's at stake is America's national security. Because if Ukraine, who is right now ammunition starved, they're going to start losing territory to Russia. There's going to be towns that will fall to Russia increasingly over the next several weeks. And they're going to get closer and closer to NATO territory. If we don't like the bill now, we are really going to hate the bill in the next several years, where we have over 200,000 US forces in Europe, 10,000 in Poland, Europe heavily invested in strengthening NATO's eastern flank. This is what frustrates me. We have to describe costs, absolutely. But I think we're not describing the costs if Ukraine is not successful and Russia succeeds, because Vladimir Putin's not going to stop. He's not. And so we've got to get this done. And so I encourage everybody, please communicate with your congressional delegation. If you think this is important, please tell them how important this is. You know from experience as an MMFer, you've been to Europe. Europeans been to, obviously, this is for our American colleagues, not our European colleagues, but, please, we have to make our voices known. This is like 1947. We know this is unpopular, but this is an investment in our victory as well as in Ukraine's.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? I know you also travel within the US to talk about this. You just
Oh,
traveled, if I'm not mistaken.
You're going to let me talk about the whistle stop.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Could you do a quick, what's your take on how does the US public think about these
So
issues?
let me first tell the MMF community, we are an exciting whistle stop tour. Come be with us on this tour. 10 cities. We have partnered with the Howard G. Buffett Foundation. We're going out to America's heartland, particularly agricultural communities, to talk about exactly what we've talked about, why Ukraine's victory is so important to America's prosperity, America's security. We had a great day last Thursday in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We met with the important Minnesotan agribusiness community, Cargill, ADM, some of the biggest global agribusiness companies in the world. We met with Governor Walz of Minnesota, the mayor of Minneapolis, the Ukrainian American community, the Ukrainian ambassador, Ambassador Oksana Marakova, joined us. We had a state proclamation, a mayoral proclamation. I was so encouraged by the support we heard. And as I said, farmers understand how important the land is to their future, to food security, to protect that land, that you would fight to protect that land. We also understand the breadbasket of the world lives in the United States and Ukraine. We have so much in common. We understand what's important, and neighbor helps neighbor. In an agricultural community, if something happens to a farmer, do you know what happens? I'm the 10th generation farmer in community. I was raised on a small farm. Every neighbor comes to help that neighbor. This is exactly what we do internationally. Ukraine is a neighbor that needs our help, and we wholly benefit from it. The Department of Defense, an anecdote, I mean, if you don't sort of buy the moral argument that this is the right thing to do to help a country restore its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, a great American ally that wants to ensure that America prospers and is secure. If you don't buy that argument, you got to buy the economic argument. So, so much of the U.S. assistance, the supplemental that we were talking about, stays in the United States. So when we were in Minnesota, $70 million of the Ukrainian supplemental went to Minnesotan companies to help them defend, for Ukrainian warriors to defend Ukraine. It is an economic benefit that comes to us. So if you don't buy the moral argument, which I hope you buy the moral argument, why are you passing up funding that's staying in your state? So this is why we just really have to be as active as possible. So in February, we're coming to Kansas City, talking to farmers there. We'll be in Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas. The list goes on. We believe we're taking this message, and this again is historic, because in 1947, 1948, they had a Marshall Plan to sell the Marshall Plan. As I said, get out of Washington, tell the American people why this is so important. And we're doing it again. And it's been fantastic just to hear how much people want to help. The American people want to be part of something greater than self. They're so generous. They understand what's right, and they understand the importance of sovereignty. So it's a fantastic thing to be part of. Stay tuned for our next Whistle Stop Tour and come along on the train with us. We're having an exciting time.
Great. I'll do one last follow-up on
Okay.
Ukraine, because we received a question that fits perfectly.
Yeah.
Someone asked, could you give us an update on the Marshall Plan for Ukraine?
Oh.
You just mentioned it. Or maybe generally about rebuilding Ukraine. I know GMF works a lot on this issue. So maybe briefly, you can, and then I'll promise we'll get to some other issues.
Yeah, no, you're on my favorite topics, but thank you. So as we talked about in the supplemental, and that primarily for the US is for military assistance. It's not just the United States that's having a tough time right now. The European Union is also running into some obstacles, one particular country obstacle, Hungary, that is blocking EU support for Ukraine. So I would say we sort of have a phased strategy, which is very much Marshall Plan. Phased was humanitarian aid and then larger aid. We need to make sure Ukraine survives this winter. And we got very, very lucky last winter. I mean, we don't want to, celebrate the climate crisis, but it was a warmer winter. That's not going to be this winter. It's going to be very cold winter. Russia is already doing massive attacks against Ukraine's electrical grid. They're trying to break their will. They're trying to, run the clock out on us. So the short term, we have to make sure Ukraine has enough military capability and enough financial assistance to pay salaries and to keep that support going. So keep Ukraine in the fight. And then next year, we're really going to concentrate on a very important conference that will be held in Berlin in June of next year. It's the Ukraine Recovery Conference. We are doing a lot of exciting work with Ukrainian mayors. And as our MMFers know, our cities program is so important. We're hoping to do more, bringing Ukrainian cities and American cities together. We're doing that with European cities, focusing on local reconstruction, regional reconstruction, sustainable, that type of development. And I just feel like right now we need to get, how do you start that marathon? You take the first step. We've got to take this first step in rebuilding. Next year will be very important. The Biden administration in September announced a new special representative, former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker, who heralds from Chicago. We're visiting Chicago on the Whistle Stop Tour. We hope she's going to be on that stop with us. She really wants to double down on getting the private sector to engage and get some wins next year to get, again, what was the Marshall Plan about? It was about making sure there was hope that a better future lies ahead. And guys, that's why under GMF, you see ideas, leadership, hope. It was the idea of the Marshall Plan. You needed brave, courageous political leaders to lead into those ideas. But at the end of the day, it is about delivering hope. The Ukrainian people need hope. They're exhausted. And if they run out of hope, then Russia wins. And we can't allow that to happen.
Great. Okay, I want to switch now to a
Switching.
different topic, a question we received from the alumni, and that is the situation in Turkey, or developments in Turkey. Turkey basically plays an important role in almost all the issues we've discussed, from helping to broker a deal on Ukrainian grain shipments or last year, but also NATO membership, not making it all that easy at first. What do you make of developments in Turkey? The question was, do we still consider Turkey a part of the Transatlantic bloc, or is it playing a different role now?
Super question, and super important and strategic country. So just 2 floors up from this conversation, we are convening some of the foremost Turkey experts in Washington, as well as in Europe, in our trilateral strategy group, something that we have done for 14 years to talk about that critical role that Turkey plays. Turkey just celebrated its 100th anniversary of the founding of the modern Turkish Republic, a secular modern republic. And so I use this example because it sort of perfectly places the challenge and the opportunity of where Turkey is. So we're excited about Turkey's 2nd century and where it will evolve, but some have suggested that that century is the Turkish century, and there's a really big difference. So will Turkey continue to play an important role in the Euro-Atlantic community? And so we've seen the role it's played in the Black Sea, ensuring initially, before Russia withdrew, a Black Sea grain deal, making sure the world did not starve, that Vladimir Putin did not hold the world hostage, to allow grain shipments from the port of Odessa in, and certainly has provided Ukraine Turkish drones that have been very successful. But at the same time, Turkey is strengthening its relationship with Russia, and it is not abiding by sanctions. So the economic activity that has grown and blossomed, because the EU may be sanctioning Russia, but the trade just diverts and goes through Turkey. And so you have that's the modern Turkey, where it has both Euro-Atlantic ambitions and aspirations, and is hugely important, but at the same time continues to favor relations with Russia. After October the 7th, we've heard some very disturbing statements from President Erdogan about support for Hamas, hosting Hamas. Turkey has not declared Hamas a terrorist organization. And we also see Turkey, strengthening its relationships with China. So it's really hard, as I talked about at the beginning, that adversarial alignment. You have Turkey having relations with the adversaries as well as its Euro-Atlantic partners. So this requires us to redouble our efforts to strengthen and anchor Turkey towards its Euro-Atlantic founding. But I will tell you, it's super challenging. On Turkey's allowing Sweden, President Erdogan over the last 2 years has repeatedly said this will happen. It's still my latest knowledge. I haven't checked anything the last 24 hours, so forgive me. It remains stuck within Turkey's Foreign Affairs Committee, so it hasn't progressed. President Erdogan's AK Party totally controls parliament. So this is a question of when he says it can go, it can go. Hungary also is blocking Sweden's membership into NATO, but Turkey sort of remains the key. So I think continued pressure is going to have to be applied to Turkey to get this over the transom. And of course, if you followed some headlines the last day or two, actually, the Treasury Department has come out very strongly, not only on Turkey not abiding by Russian sanctions, but perhaps financing Hamas. And so this is going to continue to cause friction, but I can't begin to tell you, this is the inflection point. Turkey is behaving, we call as a middle power or swing state. It's choosing this fluid moment in the international system. I call it the all of the above strategy, but at some point it will have to take some strategic choices of the direction of travel. And we don't know when that day will come, but the day will, I think, eventually come.
Right. Let me just follow up on one part you mentioned, and it was also an alumni question, and that's we have to talk about the situation in Israel and Palestine. I wanted to ask you the transatlantic perspective on the ongoing conflict. We've seen broadly aligned positions between European countries and the US, but we've seen some divisions within our countries. What is your current take? It's a very fluid situation, obviously. Where do things stand from a transatlantic perspective in that conflict, and how does it play out going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very difficult to follow and watch the EU try to develop a clear and consistent policy towards the conflict. In the very earliest days after the conflict, you had a variety of voices that were more supportive of Israel, were more supportive of the Palestinians. So that sort of weakened, I think, the EU's ability to project its own power. I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes the word usage is slightly different, but I think the US and the European Union, while acknowledging Israel's right for self-defense and the activities that have taken, that has to follow international law, protect civilians. And this is, I think, we're all watching, again, this drama unfold in the conflict now, moving from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, and the casualties that are increasing. You have to start, beginning to assess now, how do you want this to begin to end and to resolve? And I think there's where no one has a clear policy picture. The European Union has always been extremely generous, as the US, but the EU in particular, in support for the Palestinians, building the institutions in Gaza and in the West Bank. Who will rebuild this? Where will the Palestinians go? We want to make sure Israel is safe and secure. How that happens and what the aftermath is, exactly as we said, after this, during and after the Second World War, you build for the post-war environment. So you're more secure and you can enter those processes. That feels like it's missing in the Israeli vision of how they want to ensure they're safe and secure, not just eliminating Hamas, but making sure that they can create an environment where, again, security and prosperity are the right for all the peoples. So it's going to be tremendously difficult. And right now we see this as obviously challenging for the US to sustain military support to the European theater, the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and managing these two conflicts and making sure that, again, international law, security, sovereignty, territorial integrity, but also making sure that we're building a better future after the war.
Yeah. And I think from this discussion, it's pretty obvious what you said in the beginning, how all of these different issues play into each other. And that's why it's so difficult to take them one at a time. We're running up to the end of our discussion, but we have discussed a lot of, sad and sometimes gloomy topics. I wanted to end us on a hopefully positive note and just ask you, going forward for the next year, coming close to the end of the year, what gives you hope in transatlantic relations for the world? Is there something that you think next year there might be a change for the better that we could all use now?
Well, GMF gives me hope every single day, whether it's the extraordinary response we have had from our community on the GMF Hope Fund through the day of Thanksgiving and honoring that helps Ukrainians in need. Look, my hope is, and I'll get back to exactly what I said, we know from our history, we can do this. We need confidence, we need clarity, we need courage, and we know we're stronger together. We know this is why the transatlantic relationship is so vital. Our allies in the Indo-Pacific, we're a smaller group and the world is getting scarier. That's why we have to hold tight, strengthen one another, and work together in a very constructive way. As I said, what I fear the most is that we are taking counsel of that fear, and that we are not exuding the courage and the clarity and the confidence that I see every day in the faces of the Ukrainian people that are suffering unimaginable things. And they wake up every day and they fight for a better future. We have to fight for this better future. Democracy is a fight every single day. We have to get our voices out, lift our voices up, tell people what's important and why, and help our neighbors in need. That's what we do, whether we're working with cities, working with MMF. So that's what gives me great hope. That's why in 2024, we want to make sure we find all our MMF alumni, bring them back home, help our neighbors, help one another. So that's why I'm excited about 2024. The hope, the togetherness, that's what GMF represents. And as we're memorial to this inflection point, we did pretty well the last inflection point. I'm going to throw a bet down. We're going to do just fine with this inflection point with courage, confidence, conviction, clarity. We can do this. So that's where my hope comes from.
Great. I'm not going to risk ruining this positive note at the end by asking another question. So I want to thank you, Heather, and I want to thank Karin, our Director of Alumni Relations. And I want to thank you all for joining us. We would like to hear from you what you thought of this potentially, well, the first one of hopefully many virtual briefings.
I hope we'll do it again. I hope we'll come back after this.
I'll be the regular host volunteering. And so please let us know what you thought. And then I'm thinking Karin will be in touch with future events soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy holidays.